Good morning, everyone. I think we'll have a few others joining us shortly as they're admitted from the waiting room. I'm Nancy Brynildson, and I'm glad to be with you here today. I am also here with my co-director, and I'll let Dr. Garcia introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Garcia, also statewide literacy co-director at the California Department of Education, and I'm grateful to be here to share some updates on California's comprehensive literacy policies and resources. I'll turn it back over to Nancy, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Bonnie. Our presentation today is to really bring you up to date with everything going on in literacy, and it's a lot. And to give you some sense of where we're headed. This is how you can contact us, Statewide Literacy Campaign at cde.ca.gov. And Bonnie and I are both happy to respond to email questions. We are focusing on a comprehensive approach to move the needle for student learning in literacy, mathematics, and science. Specifically in literacy, which I will show you a graphic for that in a moment, we are continuing the work that State Superintendent Thurman began when he established the campaign for reading by third grade and beyond, which aims to ensure literacy and biliteracy for all students in California. What we know is that improving student achievement requires comprehensive and coherent systems at the state level, at the school district level, and also at the school site. And so what we'll be sharing today is really the outline of the state system, and with, of course, implications for what folks need to be doing at the school and site level, school and district level. So here we are with the elements of the system centered on best first instruction with instructional guidance, materials, and formative and summative assessments. Really supported on both ends, bookended, if you will, by planning and development, site planning, as well as district planning, leadership, preparation of educators, and professional learning and coaching, as well as tiered supports for learning, screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring, assessments, acceleration, and intervention. And of course, all of these things overlap. But what we wanted to share with you are some of the investments that California has made to ensure that we have a robust system. We have had the Literacy Coaches and Reading Specialists grant for many years now. It's moving into its third or fourth year, and we're moving into our third cohort, in fact. But it has a requirement to do a literacy plan. And in fact, there is a statewide literacy plan for just that purpose for all of our efforts at the state level. Leadership has a special emphasis in the LCRS Educator Training Grant, as well as a new feature, which you'll hear more about in a bit from new legislation related to credentialing. And to finish off this sort of section of planning and development, there are lots of new things in preparation. If you haven't caught up with all of the developments and changes in credentialing for multiple subjects, single subject, education specialist teachers, as well as PK3 ECE specialist credentials. And there are some new requirements which we'll tackle in just a bit. All of this is available to you. If you go to the exhibit hall, we have a PDF of the slideshow as well as a handout for you. More about that handout in a bit. And then the very last area under planning and development is professional learning and coaching. And I won't go through every single grant project that we have had, but you can see that for the last, I would say, 5 years, all of these grants have added to what we have available for professional learning. And another new piece from new legislation, which we'll share with you in a bit. That moves us to Best First Instruction and all of the investments there. Guidance has been really the central piece of what the department has done, starting with standards, moving to the new PTKLF learning foundations, the framework, the English Learner Roadmap, the dyslexia guidelines. And just in the last year and this year, we have content blocks, progressions, more about all of that briefly in just a moment, as well as the Governor's Golden State Literacy Plan. Instructional materials. We had a full adoption in 2015, but upcoming is a follow-up adoption in 2026, which we'll talk about. Formative and summative assessments. This is a system we all know and love, CASP, and Smarter Balance. There's a Spanish assessment and alternate assessments, as well as interim assessments available for district use. And then in LPAC, or the English Language Proficiency Assessments, the initial, the summative, the alternate, and interim assessments. And finally, tiered supports for learning, screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring assessments. Screening for risk of reading difficulties has an asterisk as a new item. Really, the legislation went into effect over a year ago, but this is the year that it is operational in school districts. And then in the category of acceleration and intervention, we have had a long-standing grant to the Orange County Department of Education for multi-tiered system of supports, on which most of this is based, and then a number of grants that do address intervention under the professional learning category. So where does that take us? That takes us to California's approach to literacy and biliteracy, and I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Nancy. Those initiatives and the work that were just shared are really nestled into California's approach for literacy and biliteracy. And in May of this year, we were given an opportunity to develop this statement that I'm going to share with you in just a bit, as we released the Literacy Professional Learning Pack, which included the Literacy Roadmap content blocks for TK through grade 5, as well as the P3 learning progressions for language and literacy. It was really an opportunity for us to communicate California's approach and the context in which the guidance that we were releasing at the time and the guidance from the initiatives and the work that Nancy noted earlier are included in and what they belong to. And what that approach builds on, and if you can go to the next slide, Nancy, is decades of educational research that applies to California's culturally and linguistically rich, diverse student population. That includes our science of reading and literacy and the science of learning and development. And that is also, and if you can go to the next slide, an intentional approach that really promotes carefully sequenced initial instruction, just carefully sequenced instruction in general, that has appropriate practice and reinforcement, because we know how important practice and reinforcement is. That it also includes interventions as necessary, and we've talked about the screener as being one of the new initiatives that are put in place, and we'll talk more about that and how interventions will be needed there as appropriate. And also meaningful applications of this approach across all content areas. in addition to the application of it in English language arts. Oh, this is feeling a little funny. There we go. It also, the approach
Me?
values the development of knowledge and skills in language arts, again, and across disciplines, including world languages, based on our students' assets and needs, the assets and needs that we know, and the assets and needs that we also gather from our assessment. And also, this first paragraph of the statement notes that the approach recognizes and you can go to the next slide, the importance of ensuring that students have access to instruction that is joyful, that it's motivating, that is affirming both linguistically and culturally, and that is appropriate developmentally, having experiences that lead to strong content knowledge. So it's connected, building meaning from what students are learning, and building motivation and engagement, and that it also has experiences that build effective communication skills. The second part of our statement includes that California's approach and the guidance that are included in our approach promote evidence-based instruction that teaches foundational skills. And we know that foundational skills, and much of our legislation includes this, the legislation including that was noted by Nancy earlier, crank concepts, phonological phonemic awareness, phonics, word recognition, and fluency, including or alongside oral language, vocabulary, comprehension, writing, speaking, and listening, all of which are included in our ELA ELD framework, and we see this across the 5 themes. In addition, an approach that includes integrated and designated ELD instruction that are incorporated for our English learner students, and opportunities to be able to develop biliteracy provided for all students. And 2 more things is that we're providing students with supplemental and intensified support. So really thinking about the multi-tiered system of support that we have in place, where we're able to provide instruction to students who need that additional support, students with reading difficulties, students with exceptional needs, even our students who are English learners who might need supplemental and intensified supports. And lastly, our approach includes, and the guidance that is nestled in this approach, ensuring that learning progress and literacy outcomes for our students, our work, is carefully monitored, that we're ensuring that what we're doing is improving student outcomes, and that is looking at our systems that include instruction, curriculum, and assessments, so we have a coherent and effective approach to moving the needle on literacy outcomes for all students in California. And with that, I turn it back over to Nancy, who is going to discuss the next part of our presentation here.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm lingering on this slide because I want you to see the link to the California literacy page. And that's where this statement is currently housed, but it's also where you'll see lots of information about what we are presenting today.
And really quickly, Nancy, that statement is also included in the handout that I know you said you were going to be mentioning.
Right. And in fact, the handout you will find if you go to the exhibit hall and look for there's a display, just as a hint, that it looks like a tier. So we're number 19. So we're kind of up in the upper left-hand corner. If you click on that, you will find both a PDF of this PowerPoint, and you'll find a handout that is organized by, first of all, that graphic, the statement that Bonnie just took us through, and then recent or new California literacy initiatives, and then ongoing initiatives. So that's an orientation to that handout for you. There are 6 initiatives that we plan to focus on in this presentation. The literacy roadmap, the learning progressions, the P3 learning progressions, screening for risk of reading difficulties, new legislation AB 1454, which you've probably already heard about, the follow-up adoption for ELA, ELD, and literacy professional development. So that is where we will head next. The California Literacy Roadmap is actually not brand new. It was legislated in 2023, but or 2022, we have been developing materials to support the roadmap. And last May, the first of the products from the roadmap was released and is a part of that professional learning pack that Bonnie mentioned. It's literacy content blocks for English medium classrooms in grades TK through 5. And that is available. There's a tab on the California Literacy website. We anticipate that content blocks for grades 6 through 12, it'll be 6-8 and 9-12, will also be released this spring. And then multilingual literacy guidance will be released this spring. And that will round out the products for the literacy roadmap as they're currently planned. Just to give you a sense of the literacy content blocks, which we really think provide you a good tool to use both at the school and district levels. They're organized by, there's an introduction, so it's laid out in tabs. So the introduction first, which we would call your attention to because it really cross-cuts all of the grade levels. And then you'll see that specific grade levels or spans. Each of those has, and we'll show you a couple screenshots in a moment, an overview and basic principles of instruction, really functioning as a small introduction for that particular grade level. And then 4 areas of literacy and language instruction: language, foundational literacy skills, integrated reading and writing, and comprehensive ELD. Those are further organized by sub-areas. So the first area is language. And then under foundational literacy skills, as Bonnie mentioned, print concepts, phonological/phonemic awareness, phonics and word recognition, reading fluency, integrated reading and writing, with both reading, engaging with text, and writing, and then comprehensive ELD, which is both integrated and designated. So here you see just the beginning of the language area. And it begins with a definition. You see that in italics, and that definition really cross-cuts all of all the grade levels. So you might say, gee, some of that is above what a TK child can do, but this is really looking at the entire span with a recommended duration, how much time, and you'll see in later areas more specific suggestions for time allocations. Then there are evidence-based practices. That's key content that should be taught in each area with accompanying instructional routines or strategies. So this is just a page 7 from grade 1, showing you a sample from phonics and word recognition. So you see another definition for this sub area of phonics and word recognition. So how do we suggest these might be used? Well, what's nice about them is in some ways just a very short version of the things in the framework that are explained in much greater detail. And we think that there are lots of ways it could be used by individuals and to reflect on their own practice, but then for teams to do planning, for teams to discuss expectations, approaches, materials, and to be looking at data, results of instruction, and then what responses need to occur. Both school-wide and individual plans for professional learning, including coaching. And of course, this analogous process could be used at the district level. Development of school and district literacy plans, including a multi-tiered system of support. That's critical for all of this. And looking at curricula and materials, which you'll have an opportunity to shortly to do in this follow-up adoption. So these may not be all the ways it could be used, but it's meant to be a tool. So now I want to take a couple of minutes to share with you the learning progressions. As you probably are aware, the preschool transitional kindergarten learning foundations were published in 2024. And then on the heels of those documents, because they're in language and literacy, mathematics, and many other areas, learning progressions were developed to really show how learning progresses according to the foundations and standards across preschool through grade 3. And I'll show you a screenshot of that in a moment, with in-practice examples of what that instruction could look like. So here you see in this screenshot, the first two columns are the preschool transitional kindergarten learning foundations, lovingly known as PTKLF, and then the Common Core State Standards in ELA literacy across kindergarten through 3rd grade. And so each area, and this area of meaning making, is presenting a progression of children's development across those age spans and grade spans. Not surprisingly, they've used the 5 themes of the framework to organize some of the areas in this particular language and literacy development. Here's a screenshot of an in-practice example. So playful approaches to foundational skills. And so there are examples across P through 3rd grade levels to illustrate a range of instructional supports to and approaches to support students' development. There are some highlights that are noted at the end of each of these examples. This is one that shows you some of the key notions here: supporting children in expressing themselves, a range of instructional practices, etc. And then there are call-out boxes for designated English language development, as you see shaded here at the bottom. So it really presents a full array of possible instruction across those grade levels and ages. So with that, and I guess I'll just add on to one more comment before we turn it over to Bonnie, that the same sorts of uses that I shared for the literacy content blocks are what could be done with these P3 progressions. In fact, we're suggesting that teachers and other educators would use them together. Okay, Bonnie, off to you. Another initiative.
Thank you, Nancy. Yes, this is an initiative that is, I think, very near and dear to many of our hearts. And so if you can go to the next slide, Nancy. In fact, we see it in Governor Newsom's budget summary for that was released this year, where he includes that we need to be identifying students early so that we are providing supports in a timely fashion. That way we are not waiting until issues get to a point where they are become difficult and more costly to support. And the screener, as this shows here, is for kindergarten through second grade for those purposes. So moving to the next slide, you'll notice that the legislation includes that beginning this year, our K through 2 students are to be screened for risk of reading difficulties, including dyslexia and other possible neurological disorders. And that the screening instruments that are used by districts, you can go back, Nancy, need to be adopted by districts' governing boards, and that they need to be an instrument that was approved by the Reading Difficulties Risk Screener Selection Panel, the RDRSSP. And this approved list has instruments that are evidence-based, culturally and linguistically and developmentally appropriate. A lot went into selecting these instruments with a lot of very rigorous criteria. And in languages that reflect the primary languages of students in California to the extent that these instruments were available. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. In the next slide, you'll see that the results of the screening are to be used for a flag of potential need, a potential risk of a reading difficulty, not as a diagnosis or a disability. We really need to think through this as a part of a broader process, as a part of our multi-tiered systems of support, where we are determining needs, identifying the appropriate supports for our students within our classrooms, providing targeted interventions as needed, and if more is needed, further diagnosis if concerns do not resolve. In the next slide, it'll show the information around the selection panel, so the RDRSSP, which was appointed by the state board in January of 2024. And they used the criteria and evaluation process that I just referenced that is very close to the statute. They developed this and according to what the statute included, and that criteria and the evaluation process was approved in May by the state board and was used to ultimately get to the list that we're going to show you next. And that was approved in December that was approved by the RDRSSP December 16th. Of 2024. And what you'll see here are the 4 different instruments that were approved, their organization, the title, the grade levels they were approved for, as well as the languages. You'll know that some of them, like Amira and Multitudes, who were approved for both English and Spanish, have the same name for both, where like M-Class and Lectura have different names for their different screeners. The English is M-Class, Lectura is Spanish. So some slight differences there. We also have an information overview available for each one of these screeners that will know, in addition to what you see here, which are skills measured, the organization, the supports that are provided for students with special needs, students who are English learners, being able to determine language proficiency, the amount of training, administration, and much else. But what you do see here that is also really helpful in noting is what is required for screening. What are some additional optional measures that are also available and at the discretion of a district should they choose to go beyond what is required? And each of the screeners does have slight differences where you have Amira, for example, having all of the measures that are required. And you see here with M-Class and Lectura where there's some variations. It's the same with Multitudes and it's the same with ROAR. So it's really important to take a look at that as districts are planning what their screening is going to consist of, and possibly even what other assessments throughout the year will include. Next slide, please. What we also, what's also included in the legislation are some timelines, and the legislation is clear. There is, districts are to screen K through 2 one time a year. However, districts can determine if they want to screen more than once, if they want to screen twice or 3 times a year. What districts do need to do is when they do screen for purposes of the statute, there needs to be notification sent to parents, guardians at least 15 days in advance that lets them know that this screening is going to take place. And then results along with next steps, especially for students who have a flag of some need to be provided to parents. So all parents of all students taking the screener within 45 days. And then next steps for those students, especially who are flagged with some risk or with some level of need. And then students who enroll after to a school after their grade level has already been screened will need to be screened within 45 days of enrollment, unless, for example, they've already been screened in their previous district and those results can be submitted to the new district, or if the parent opts them out or exempts them, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. But a couple of other things is districts will also need, when determining when they're screening students, the legislation is clear in saying that students need to have sufficient instruction in foundational skills to be screened for purposes of this statute. And actually, we can go on to the next slide, Nancy, because I'll talk a little bit more about that other piece here. So other important provisions that the legislation includes is screening of multilingual learners. Legislation states that students are to be screened in English unless they don't have sufficient language in English. They are to be screened in their primary language. Now, if that primary language, if a screener in the student's primary language is not available, then an LEA does need to develop and implement a process for evaluating that student's risk, even though that student's primary language does not have a set screener. There does need to be this alternative process set in place to evaluate that risk. Now, there has been questions kind of pertaining to this and a little bit outside of it, which includes, can we screen students who are English learners who might have, for example, sufficient language in English, but they're English learners, and we want to go ahead and screen them also. We want to screen them in English and in Spanish, or they're in a dual language immersion program, and we'd like to see if we can screen them in English and in Spanish. The legislation neither requires nor precludes that a district can screen a student more than once. So that is at a district's discretion. But the legislation is clear. They need to be screened at least once, and students need to be screened in English unless they have a primary language and they don't have sufficient language in English. There is also opt-outs and exemptions. Any parent and guardian of any student can opt their student out. They need to do so in writing annually. Now, students who fall under 3 criteria can be exempted by their parent guardian in writing also annually. And that is if they have an IEP or a 504, or if they're eligible for an IEP or 504 already, if they already have an identified reading difficulty, if they already have an identified reading disability, or if the student is currently being evaluated for eligibility for an IEP or a 504. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, when a student is flagged for at risk, supports and services do need to be identified. And this is where that 45-day notice that's being sent home needs to include some of this information so the parent knows what's going to happen next. In addition, there are unacceptable uses of screening, and we made a note, it's not to be used for diagnosing any disabilities. It's also not to be used for reclassification, for anything high stakes, such as teacher evaluation, um, or holding a student back or retaining a student or anything of that sort. Is there another slide after this, Nancy? No, okay. So those are a couple of parts of the legislation related to screening that is being implemented this year. And there are many questions that continue to come to our office, and we encourage those questions to continue to come to our office so we can support, and we know where we need to provide the support and possible areas of guidance. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. There's a lot of information on the California Literacy webpage, and you'll find much more specific information, but our best advice is to read the education code. It's actually fairly straightforward for all of these details about timelines and supports and services, etc. And the last thing I'll say about screening, because Bonnie and I've been spending a lot of time on this, is that take a close look at those information overviews. Be really clear. Screening is meant to be brief, and be clear about which tasks are actually being administered as a part of the screening and what that information gives you. It's the beginning of a conversation. With that, I will move on to our next topic, and thank you, Bonnie. The new legislation, AB 1454 on pupil literacy. This, you've probably heard about this in the news, but it was the result of extensive negotiations and different pieces of legislation have been introduced over the last few years. But this was passed ultimately by the legislature unanimously in September, signed by the governor. He had a great press conference where our superintendent also spoke, and it was supported by a range of diverse organizations. And you see the list there: EdVoice, Decoding Dyslexia, California Federation of Teachers, the Reading League, etc., CABE. The legislation represents a comprehensive approach to literacy that promotes evidence-based instruction. And in fact, it's intended to sort of fill out that system that we've been describing to you in this presentation, align with the framework and center the needs and supports for multilingual learners. In reality, this legislation is really enacted in concert with the 25-26 budget and trailer bill. So you kind of have to put both of those pieces together. But specifically, the legislation aims to improve pupil literacy by enhancing professional development. And Bonnie's going to talk a bit more about that came out of the budget and trailer bill. Updating instructional materials, and strengthening certification of specialists and administrators. So what you can expect to see are new standards for the certification of those earning a reading and literacy leadership specialist credential, an added authorization in reading and literacy, or an add-on to an administrative services credential for new administrators. So I will share information about something we've all been waiting for, is the adoption of new materials, but this is a follow-up adoption, which makes it a little bit different. The Budget Act did authorize this new adoption, a follow-up adoption. It's in Education Code. There is a provision for doing it, which means that we use the same criteria that are in the framework, Chapter 12, and that were used during the 2015 adoption. And in July of this year, the state board acted on this and approved a notice of intent, a schedule of events, and an application for reviewers and content review experts. And I'll show you a timeline in just a bit. In fact, right here. You can see that the invitation to submit is going out, has gone out to publishers. They need to indicate their intent to submit. And then there will be meetings for publishers to go over those details, but their submission forms are due in March. That is in preparation for the work that the reviewers will do. So they are, the application period for reviewers has closed. And then a list will be recommended by the Instructional Quality Commission to the state board, who will then act. Our expectation is that the board will act in January. The publishers have to provide materials to the reviewers in order for them to be examined and through the spring and then the deliberations in July. You see 2 weeks there. That's going to depend on how many different programs are submitted. They will then issue reports to the IQC. The IQC will adopt a list, which will go to the state board, and we hope that we'll have a list of materials through a follow-up adoption in November. Now, there are some special things about this particular adoption because the legislation also approved funding to an organization to create guidance to support this adoption, because we know that things have changed in the last 10 years since the framework and the criteria were created. And the guidance is to address the evaluation, to help evaluate materials, including those that focus on the teaching of very specific skills and standards, aligning to evidence-based means of teaching foundational skills, as well as attending to all the other aspects of the language arts, including tiered supports for identified subgroups, and to incorporate media literacy. So this is a little different. We've never had guidance developed for a particular adoption over and above the framework, but this makes sense given the timing. This guidance will serve multiple purposes. First of all, it's going to extend to transitional kindergarten. It will enable flexible adoption approaches and center evidence-based practice, and support California's diverse learners, and as we said, provide tiered supports. Notably, just to be very clear about this, it addresses how materials may include partial programs organized around groups of standards that, when paired with other materials and resources, can be used to create a whole program. As we know, districts have been looking at programs to support foundational skills, programs to support other aspects of the language arts. So this document was created. WestEd was the organization that developed it in conjunction with the English Learner Success Forum. And it has 4 parts. The first part is well worth a close look. And in the handout that we've provided you, you have links to all of the documents that we've referred to. So there's a research foundation with materials implications at the beginning. And then there are program updates. It's this nice side-by-side display of the 2015 criteria, and then with the implications of the guidance from 2025, updated evaluation categories, and then some considerations for the local agencies. And the good news is that the board examined all of this and approved it last Thursday. With that, I'll turn it over to Bonnie to talk about the other new big development in literacy, professional development programs.
Yes, and seeing we have 5 minutes, I'm going to go through this a little quickly. So moving to the next slide. The new Education Omnibus Trailer Bill of this year, AB 121, Section 15, requires that the State Board of Education approve and that the Department of Education post criteria and guidance for the selection and development of in-service professional development programs for TK through 5, as well as have a list of professional programs that are deemed to meet that criteria posted by September 30th of 2026. And we're a bit ahead of the game with the criteria and guidance. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Now, going back to that previous slide, the legislation also includes $200 million for LEAs to provide professional development on effective means of teaching literacy. So PD, that's aligned to that criteria. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, beginning next year, 26-27 to 29-30. Moving forward to the next slide, the criteria that is included and guidance, what's included in legislation for the criteria and guidance is that PD programs need to follow precepts, so principles of effective professional development, that they are focused on literacy content, interactive, collaborative, that they have models of effective practice, coaching, that there's opportunities for feedback and reflection, time to master concepts, and time to demonstrate mastery. And moving on to the next slide, that they also align with Ed Code 44259, which are the minimum requirements for multiple subject, single subject, and education specialist credentials, which include evidence-based means of teaching foundational skills. And this legislation also includes attending to other aspects of language arts, including tiered supports for students who are reading with difficulties, English learners, students with exceptional needs. Also, that it's aligned to CTC's current teaching performance expectations. So our TPEs, our program standards around literacy that came forth as a result of SB 488, which Nancy mentioned earlier, and that they're also in alignment with our framework and our California dyslexia guidelines and include integrated and designated ELD. Moving on to the next slide, I mentioned we're ahead of the game because the CDE drafted in support and collaboration with the state board criteria and guidance and actually posted it for public input in October, collected that input, made updates, and presented the criteria and guidance to the state board just last week, which was approved. So there's some little updates that are going to be made, but the posting of this will come soon. The criteria is organized into two different areas. One really being around the model and delivery. So looking at our quality professional learning standards, making sure that the models are interactive and collaborative, that they're evidence-based, that they include coaching, reflection and feedback, as well as check-ins for mastery, and that they include effective means of teaching literacy. So much of what we discussed earlier at the universal level for TK through 5 with their framework, alignment with framework and the dyslexia guidelines, explicit systematic, and including foundational skills, oral language vocabulary, background knowledge, comprehension, writing, integrated and designated ELD and interventions. I just want to say all that because all of that is really important. And all the guidance includes which staff will participate. And this legislation really calls for certificated and classified staff who teach TK through 5 literacy and that teach TK through 5 literacy and who have not passed the literacy performance assessment that is now in lieu of the RECA as that's been sunsetted. And so really thinking through that and process for selection, developing a team, and then determining which pathway are we going to take according to the criteria. Are we going to choose one from the list? Are we going to choose one off the list, refining or developing, and making sure that it's in alignment? Other considerations such as time, resources, connections to other materials, and dual language immersion programs, our TK educators, reporting requirements, and continuous improvement to ensure that what we are implementing is working and that it's sustainable. So I went through that really quick because we're at time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Nancy. Oh, and there's this list of this list of a timeline. So you'll see there's the invitation to submit that's coming out really soon, a review committee that will be put in place to review and deliberate over programs that were submitted. And then there's going to be the approval, the recommendation and the approval process, as well as a time for reporting. And then there will be technical assistance webinars to support PD programs who want to submit and districts who are trying to use the criteria as well as implement the legislation. So now I will turn it over to Nancy.
And with that, we hope that you can see how all these pieces are really fitting together to create a robust system within the state to support literacy achievement, and that they have significantly strengthened our system. We have seen this year, and Bonnie mentioned this, an increase in our performance in literacy in the ELA literacy section of the CASP, 1.8 percentage points, which is a large year-over-year increase in achievement, but we're still not where we need to be. Our task now is to support school districts and schools as they strengthen their systems. And we hope this gives you a nice template for considering how they can support their students to achieve in literacy. Bonnie and I are going to be in the roundtable from 12:30 to 1:30 in case you have questions. We appreciate you being here, hanging in there with us. Thank you very much.